Hi everybody, this is Mr. Nolan, and I just want to talk to you about what we discussed in class today. This really sort of tidily wraps up the Decomposers unit, because we discussed all of the evidence that we observed with our fungi, and then conclusions, what that is supposed to mean. So if we look at something like our 3.3 evidence-based argument tool, what I want to remind you about is that these questions, matter movement, matter change, and energy change, they might be kind of weird ways to phrase these sorts of observations, but basically the matter movement question is asking about changes in mass. So it's asking how did our mass change. In matter change question, this is really asking about chemical changes, chemical change. In other words, what happened to our BTB? That's kind of what the matter change question is usually asking. And then energy change question is just sort of a generic question about what evidence do we find that energy was involved in our observations. So let's just kind of start with the matter movement question, mass. What we observed was that the plates of our fungi actually, the ones that had fungus, decreased in mass a lot more than the ones that didn't have fungus. So for the plates that did not have fungus, we only saw a change of about 14.5 grams. But the plates that had fungus, we found that they changed by almost 21 grams. And this is with all of my sections all added together. So what this means is that there's this sort of big black hole that is different, right? There's actually a difference between our fungus group and our no fungus group. So there was still a change. Both of them we saw a change. It was just this one we saw a much greater change than we saw with this one. And so this change, this difference between the two, is probably explained by the presence of the fungus. So let's kind of add that to our argument-based or evidence-based argument tool. We've got a mass change. So what we observed in our evidence was that the plates with fungus changed in mass more than without. So the plates that had fungus actually lost more mass than the ones that did not. And so what could this mean? Well, there's a few things that you might be able to conclude from this. One of them, if we just keep it simple, is that the fungus caused the bread, which is what it was growing on, to lose mass. So our bread actually lost mass because of that fungus. The reason we know it was the fungus that caused it is because this is the only group that had fungus in the plates. This one did not have fungus. So this change that we notice must be a result of the presence of fungus. So what we really have is an experimental group here and then a control group here that we can use to kind of compare these. Pretty interesting. So we jump back over here and start thinking about chemical changes. What chemical changes do we observe? Well, if you check out my other video on the BTB, what happened to the BTB, we noticed that when we put the plates of fungus next to the BTB, our blue BTB turned green. Our blue BTB actually turned green. So what does this mean? Well, if you don't recall, BTB turns more yellow if it's got carbon dioxide added. So what must have happened was that my blue BTB had carbon dioxide that was added, and that was why it turned green. So CO2 entered the BTB. And by the way, that CO2 came from the fungus. It came from the decomposer. So now let's jump down at energy. So let's think about energy. You might remember the compost pile I showed you a few weeks ago, and when I stuck the thermometer in the compost pile, it read 101 degrees Fahrenheit. Pretty doggone hot. And so this is an observation that we can make to say, well, there must be energy involved as well here. So we notice that a rotting compost pile rotting compost pile is hot, right? Could be upwards of 100 degrees. Pretty darn hot. And so think about it this way. Our decomposers are using this compost pile as food. So they're really taking this food, this chemical energy, and they're converting it into heat energy and probably some kinetic energy. So what this means is that the decomposer, such as the fungus, so our decomposer is converting chemical energy into heat energy. So that's pretty interesting. So these are three interesting things that we can sort of assume based on these observations. The plates with the fungus changed in mass more than without fungus, and therefore that means the fungus caused the bread to lose mass. That experimental group, the fungus caused the bread to lose mass. Our blue BTB turned green when we put the fungus in with the BTB. That must mean that carbon dioxide entered the BTB. And then lastly, because of our compost pile that we looked at, our rotting compost pile is hot. Therefore, our decomposers are converting chemical energy into heat energy. So these are probably the important conclusions that we should run away with, and probably want to add them to our summary table, as I indicated here. So this is really a good way to sort of sum up the most important things that we looked at over this unit in terms of mass changes, in terms of chemical changes, our BTB, and in terms of energy, that our decomposers are producing heat energy from chemical energy. So good luck on the test. I hope that this is helpful to sort of sort of summarize all this stuff. You should be adding this to your summary table, which is also on my website. But best of luck studying if you need to, and I will see you when you take the test.